when the residents of Ivy Street in Burnley were startled from the piercing cries of help permeating from outside of their homes. Little would they realise the horrors that would soon unfold. This, my friends, is the story of James Stezaker. James Riley Stezaker was born 6 December 1889 at 40 Cameron Street in Burnley to parents William and Maria Stezaker. And sometime around 1908-1909, James had met a lady called Florence, and she was much older than James, around 10 years older. Florence was a widow at this time. Now, she had already been married twice before, her first husband being that of James Sheridan. Now, Florence and James married on the 12th of April 1909 over in Burnley, and 5 months later, on the 5th of September, Florence gave birth to a little girl whom they named Mary. Now, for the purpose of today's video, we are going to retell the story and the events that happened on the 12th of October 1912, and these all occurred here in Burnley at number 3 Ivy Street. We're not going to travel to Ivy Street because the house they lived in, or once lived in, has long since been demolished. But we will put videos, we will put photographs over the top of this video as we're talking and as we name these places. But you will see that, like I said, number 3 Ivy Street has long since gone. This story also has been submitted to us by a family relative of the Stezakers. We won't name that person's name during this video, just for the sake of her own privacy, but she did contact us, giving us quite a fair bit of detail about this story in particular, and all we've done since is delve a little bit deeper, digging out the old newspaper articles, as you guys know, which we do, and we've found some interesting photos, we've found some interesting information on this case. But we do wish to thank that lady in question, but like I said, we're not going to name her name in this video, simply out of respect to that lady, and like I said, keeping her name a little bit private. Now, obviously, if that person wishes to comment on the video down below, that's entirely her choice. But we do wish to thank that lady, and like I said, giving us the opportunity to retell this dark story, because it is a dark story. It involves the death of a little girl. It also involves the murder of a wife, and well, I won't give too much away just yet, because we'll get to what happened, like I said, during the events of 12th of October 1912. Now, together, both Florence and James run, I think it was 8 looms between them both at 2 different mills. One of the mills being Coronation Mill in Burnley, and the other mill being that, I think it was the Thornton, Tattersall and Co. Mill, I think it was called. I'll put all the names down below anyway, but they run several looms in 2 different mills. From all accounts, both James and Florence were a well-to-do family. They were well liked, they were respectable, hardly in any trouble with any authorities, such as obviously their employers. And like I said, they were a well liked couple. They'd moved to number 3 Ivy Street, and like I said, they had a little girl who was named Mary, or who they called Mary, I should say. And it was around 10:45 p.m. when tragedy would strike the family. Now, living with the Stezakers, James, Florence and their daughter Mary, was James's sister's sister, so Florence's sister. And all we know her name is, or what she was called, was Mrs. Tootle. We don't have a first name for her, but she was living with the Stezakers, and from what we've uncovered and unravelled, this was because James had threatened it was either his life to take his own life or the life of his wife, Florence. Mrs. Tootle, the sister of Florence, well, she arrived home at around 11:15 p.m, not 10:45 p.m. as first said. But when she got to the house, something grabbed hold of her. She knew something wasn't right. It was eerily quiet. So she called out for Florence and James and never got any replies. She made her way up to the bedroom of Florence and James, only to find them both seemingly unconscious. Now, she knew something wasn't right. So she raced downstairs, opened the front door and went into the streets, crying loudly for help. Now, two passers-by came past. One was a man called Ingham Ridehouse, and another man called Edward King. Now, the upper part of number 3 Ivy Street included the front bedroom where James and his wife and daughter both, well, they all slept in that room. It was in complete darkness, but worryingly, there was a strong odour of gas throughout the house itself, not just the bedroom. And it was deemed unwise to strike a match. Therefore, Ridehouse and King entered the bedroom in the darkness, and they managed to find the bodies of both James and his wife, Florence. Now, the bodies of James and Florence were both brought downstairs. James himself was placed at the foot of the stairs towards the front door, which was now open. It would appear straight away that Florence herself was at this point lifeless. James had a very faint pulse. Now, during the time of the crying and the screaming outside, and to the moment when obviously Ridehouse and King had gone into the bedroom and brought both James and Florence out, there was a Dr. Munro, who lived just a matter of houses away on Ivy Street, and he heard the commotion. So obviously he was one of the first to make his way to the house as well. Now, he inspected both bodies, and like I said, it was obvious straight away that Florence herself was now lifeless. But James, like I said, he had a very faint pulse. Dr. Munro proceeded to resuscitate James, but he noticed that James had a scarf tied very tightly around his neck. So obviously he's undone the scarf and he's done resuscitation, and he's brought James back around. As for Florence, they noticed that blood was trickling out of her mouth, and she had severe bruising to her neck, like she'd been in some kind of struggle. It was during this time when Mrs. Tootle realised that their child, Mary, wasn't with the couple. So again, she screamed out in panic, and both Ridehouse and King proceeded to go back into the house and up towards the bedroom, where they would find poor Mary, just like her mother, lifeless. So they brought Mary back down and placed her body alongside that of her mother, Florence. And like I said, both were now dead and they were lifeless. Mary herself, while she didn't have any incriminating marks on her body, anywhere on her face or her throat, it was obvious, I would say, straight away from Dr. Munro's reaction, that something tragic had occurred. And like I said, Florence herself wasn't just unconscious and died from the effects of gas poisoning. She had been strangled. Now, we are here retelling the story of the Stezakers in Burnley Cemetery because we know Florence and Mary were both buried together in the same grave. We do have a grave number, so we are going to try and locate where they are, where their bodies are. Again, to pay our final respects to the poor couple. And we'll get into what happened with James and the subsequent outcome of, obviously, the investigation and the inquest into the deaths of his wife Florence and his child Mary. But this is Burnley Cemetery, and we are on the hunt for Florence and Mary's grave. With the obvious commotion now taking place at number 3 Ivy Street, and with many people now outside of their homes, word soon filtered through to the police constabulary, who were quickly on the scene. After initial talks with James and Dr. Munro, it was decided at the time that obviously James was the number 1 suspect into what had occurred, and at this time nobody quite knew what had occurred, other than 2 lifeless bodies being taken from the bedroom of the upper floor. James was taken into police custody, and an investigation of the upper floor would commence. The authorities would quickly find out that a gas pipe and a bracket had been purposefully removed, obviously resulting in gas permeating throughout the bedroom and throughout the house itself. Was it an accident? Had this gas pipe inadvertently been knocked, or, like I said, had it been purposefully removed? Now, the police were quick to assume so. They were quick to assume that this was done intentionally with the purpose of taking lives. After all, you had 2 dead people. You had a young girl and you had a wife. You had James, who was unconscious when he was dragged from the upper floor, from the bedroom. He had an handkerchief tied wrappedly around his neck, and it was tied extremely tight from all accounts. James himself had tried to commit suicide, but why? Now, upon further investigation of the house, a notebook was found in the sister-in-law's bedroom, in the back bedroom. And this notebook would show police and go into some detail as to the state of mind that James was in. All this will be read out later in court, obviously, at the court hearing that James himself would ultimately attend. But it was whilst he was in police custody over in the Burnley police station that the police would find scratches on James's neck. So obviously curious as to know how they'd got there, and there were fresh scratches at that. James just simply replied saying his wife had done them whilst he was trying to strangle her. On Monday, 21st of October, James Stezaker was brought before the magistrates to face 3 charges. These charges included the willful murder of his wife Florence, the willful murder of his daughter Mary, and finally that he tried to attempt to kill himself, which back in the early 1900s was a crime in itself. At the time of the murders, James was 22 years old. Florence was 32 years old, and more tragically his daughter was just 3 years old. On the 25th of November 1912, James Stezaker appeared at the magistrates' assizes, charged, like I said, with the 3 counts, 2 of murder and 1 of attempted suicide. James didn't offer any defence. He had no defence team to try to get the charges dropped. He literally admitted straight away that he was guilty of all 3 charges. All that it needed now was to somehow uncover what his mental state was at the time of these murders and the attempted suicide, because obviously 1912 and charges so severe as murder, it would ultimately lead to the death penalty. So even though it was a relatively quick trial, because like I said, James admitted his guilt with no arguments, didn't try to use any form of defence, the judge himself obviously had no choice but to pass down the sentence of death. But he said that in doing so, he would still wait for any evidence which would show that he was of unstable mind at the time of these crimes. He would also ask several doctors if they had seen any form of mental unstableness in James while he was awaiting trial at the Manchester Strangeways police cells. Or I should say prison cells, not police cells. And doctors who medically examined James said that they found no evidence of James being of unsound mind. The only thing that they would say is that he was showing signs of remorse. He was constantly begging for forgiveness. He was constantly apologising for the crimes he committed. Like he realised that what he had done was very much wrong. He was also sending letters to and from, or I should say was receiving letters from his parents as well as sending letters to them, begging for their forgiveness, begging for his wife's family's forgiveness. Again, knowing that he had done wrong. But in the letters he was also stating that obviously the death penalty and death by hanging was obviously the right decision. He didn't want to show any form of anger towards the decision. He was taking it fully on the chin because, like I said, it seemed that he was very remorseful for it and he was going to take what one could argue was due to him. He would take the death penalty. It was the right thing to take in his own mind because of what he'd done. So it's a strange story in that even though he committed these acts of murder on his wife and young child and tried to take his own life, he was fully aware after the events and after his incarceration in prison as to the extremities of what he'd done.
Right, so we've got 17061.
Right.
Right, that's 62, so if you want standing on you.
Yeah, that's 63, which is on that corner there.
It is, yeah, 63.
So 64, 65 and 66.
So that black one should be 65.
So this, yeah, so this headstone should be 17067. I'll just show you guys. So backtracking, we know that Florence and Mary are somewhere just here, at the side of this headstone. So I won't walk over the graves, but if I take a left now, where I'm stood now roughly should be where the headstone would have been.
Yeah.
So where my feet are is where we feel the headstone of Florence and Mary is, or was, and this, behind this headstone, should be the grave of poor Florence and Mary.
And that's if they had a headstone, because there's no ground sunk to say.
Yeah, because Vicky's doing investigative work here, and if you look, there's no sign of any headstone ever being here. I personally think there will have been, but Vicky's also said we have covered many stories like this in the past where the poorer families have been placed in unmarked graves. The only reason why I feel like there would have been a headstone here is because if you just look around this little vicinity here, it is saturated with headstones.
Yeah.
But it's just for our story, these 3, 4 maybe, 3, completely gone.
Right.
So whether or not they've been taken down, and I'll show people why, they may have been removed because of this. There's brackets placed on some headstones because they're unstable. And in time, and there's another one just there, but in time these will be dangerous. So I'm thinking these have got to a point where they were too dangerous, they've removed them.
Yeah, but if you're talking like that seriously, look at that particular one.
Right.
And the one next to it. They're sunk into the actual little area.
The headstones, you mean?
Yeah, and here, there's nothing to say anything's ever been sunk.
But we know she's here.
No, she's here, but I'm just saying I don't think she's ever had a headstone. There's no sunkenness where, in line, the actual headstones go. If you look, these are sunk because it's a weight to the headstone. Do you get me?
Yeah, so you think there'd be like some kind of, where I'm stood here,
Yeah.
there's some kind of dip.
Like there's, I don't know why that's gone, but there's a divot there.
Yeah.
On this,
Yeah.
purely, it's straight. If you put it's straight.
It's a conundrum, isn't it? And it's another frustrating one because we do so many stories here and I don't know what it is about Burnley Cemetery. I'm not I mean, we're never going to blame people at Burnley Cemetery. It's not their fault the headstones aren't here, if there was one.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But we do seem to do a lot of stories and a lot of interments are here in Burnley Cemetery, aren't they? Yeah. And we do find it a struggle sometimes, or a lot at times, locating the victims of the stories. But in this case, we know we are 100%, aren't we, certain that poor Florence and her daughter Mary are buried
if that's correct,
here.
If the correct number is on the website, this is the number.
17066.
Yeah.
That is the headstone number, which should be here. And again, it's another sad one because, like you said, we come to pay our respects, and we are doing, in a way, but this is indeed the final resting place of, and I keep saying it, but of Florence and her daughter Mary.
But at least they were together.
And like we said, at least they are together. But under such tragic circumstances. Now, as we were just saying about James's mental state at the time of these murders, his lordship, like I said, he would ask for medical evidence of the state of his mind, and it was a Dr. Watson of Burnley who took to the stand. And whilst he would say that he had not examined Stezaker himself, he knew that he had been under observation at Strangeways Prison since his arrest. Now, it was Dr. Edwards who was the prison surgeon at Strangeways. He took to the stand and said he had been acquainted with the facts of the prisoner's conduct, and with the documents he left behind him, and also seen him under observation since he arrived at Strangeways on October the 30th. So the doctor himself informed the opinion that Stezaker was perfectly sane at the present time and very much able to take to his trial. So again, we're now talking about James Stezaker's mental state during the trial itself and how he was of sound mind, wasn't showing any signs of mental illness. Now, his lordship asked Dr. Edwards if Stezaker had given any reasons for his crimes, to which the doctor replied, saying Stezaker was tired of living and was miserable and depressed. Now, it was whilst in police custody and during the trial, the only thing Stezaker would offer, if you want to call it a defence, was that he killed his wife and child because he was sick of living, and he didn't want to leave his child and his wife behind in such a cruel world. And his whole intention was, and these are the words James himself used, his intention was to destroy his wife and daughter first, and then to destroy himself. And like I said, he did not want to leave them in this cruel world. Inspector Jones, when questioned, would tell how Stezaker, during his arrest, had told him, "I didn't do it through hate, I wanted us all to be together peacefully." Now, as for the marks on James's neck, obviously this will be discussed whilst being questioned at the Manchester Assizes. And again, he would reiterate what happened and how he tried to, or how he did strangle his wife Florence. It appears that Florence may have woken from the effects of the gas and noticed that her daughter Mary had succumbed to it. This alerted James. He's then woken up and he's attacked Florence. He successfully strangled Florence until she passed away herself. But during that struggle, this is when the scratches, and she attacked James to try to stop him, obviously. James then tied the handkerchief around his neck tightly in the hope that, like I said, the effects of the gas would prove to be successful in his own mind. PC Dugdale also took to the stands, and he gave a fascinating insight into the mind of James and to the events leading up to October 1912. And from all accounts, James had visited Dr. Anderson only 2 weeks prior to these events taking place. He went there, obviously, he was pleading, he was asking for help something was going on in James's mind, something in James's life, which Florence, I can only gather, didn't know about. I can only think he was suffering from bad thoughts, and he just wanted somebody to talk to. He wanted somebody to give him that help. Dr. Anderson told James that he didn't need any medication and that he just needed fresh air and to get over himself. Those were the words used, and those are the words that are printed in the newspaper archives. This is when Mrs. Tootle, the sister of Florence, decided to move in with the family 2 weeks prior to, like I said, these events taking place. This was also, she went into the house, I think, as a bit of a rock to Florence. So even though Florence may not have known what was going through James's mind at the time, something was going on behind the scenes, obviously for Florence to invite his sister over. Now, like I said at the start of this video, we have read articles that perhaps rows were taking place between Florence and James. These rows may well have been violent, we just don't know. We don't know that side of it, so I don't really want to go down that road. But obviously something was amiss enough for Mrs. Tootle, like I said, to stay with the family for those 2 weeks. But for the Dr. Anderson, to say you don't need any medication, or you just need fresh air to get over yourself, we have to remember that in 1912, mental health and the science behind it and the help behind it wasn't existent like it is today. And me and Vicky have covered many stories where mental health has proved to be a big part of the stories. And it does beg the question, if advancements in science, in psychology back in the 1900s was available then, perhaps a lot of these crimes wouldn't have taken place. During recording this video, I mentioned obviously that a notebook was found in the back bedroom where Mrs. Tootle was living, and this book itself contained a page written by James himself, and it was a goodbye to the world note. The note itself simply said, "Goodbye to all, if we should all be dead when you find us. I don't know what had come over me lately, but I don't seem to have any desire to live any longer, and cannot bear to think of my leaving my wife and child behind me. I know it will be hard times for my mother and father, also Mary Ann and Billy, as I know they will miss out on our little Mary. But I want you to all bear it as well as you can, as they at least will be better off in heaven. Florrie had always been a good wife to me. I don't want you to think we have made this up, as Florrie doesn't know anything about it. I want you to bury us in one grave. I don't want anyone to go to the expense of going in black for us, as it is a thing I don't believe in. We only have once to die, and there is not much to live for in this world. I have tried my best in my own way, but do not seem to be able to get through things as I should like. Well, as I have no more to say, only that we will all be paid, and Billy and Mary Ann should have a little, if only for what they have done for the child. Goodbye, father, mother, sisters and brothers, and all I know, if I have wronged anyone in my time, I want them to forgive me." Within the 3 weeks after being sentenced to death by hanging, James Stezaker was seen by 2 medical examiners into the state of his mental health, and they would somehow get word back to the authorities that James would have been insane or suffering from mental health issues, depression perhaps, when he took the lives of his child and his wife, as well as trying to commit suicide. And on the 12th of December 1912, James would be reprieved of the death penalty, and his sentence itself will be reduced to that of murder, obviously, but he would have to serve penal servitude for the rest of his life. Now, obviously, the people of Burnley, some were shocked and some were happy that James had dodged the death penalty. Obviously, those of his family and friends, they were extremely, extremely happy over the news, none more so than his mother and father. Obviously, people of Burnley themselves perhaps were shocked that he didn't have to face the death penalty, because at the end of the day he had killed his wife and young child. But the facts remain that James himself would admit from day one, from his arrest, that he did indeed take 2 lives as well as try to take his own. He never once tried to dodge that bullet by trying to claim insanity himself. He was more than willing to take the scaffold himself. He showed a lot of remorse in prison. Like I said, sending letters to his parents and his family and friends, receiving letters back. It's a strange story. One that I'm kind of unsure which way to go. And I say this because James only served 8 years in prison for his crimes until his release. And he would go on to wed twice more later in life. He made a life for himself once he was released from prison. Whether or not he turned his back on Florence and on his daughter, I highly doubt so. I know he killed them, I know he took their lives, but I don't think he will have turned his back fully. They would have been haunting him until his dying days himself, I would presume. Whether or not his new families, his new wife or wives, they ever knew the story, I don't know. I kind of think at some stage of his life, these crimes would have revealed themselves to his new partners, because, like I said, it was one of the ancestors who's taken us to this tale today, and we are grateful for that. So I would presume that, like I said, at some stage, perhaps he did speak about the crimes he committed and the forgiveness that he wanted. And these stories, or this story, was passed down through the generations. But it is a shocking one, and it's one, like I said, I'm kind of on the fence with. Do I think James should have hung for the murder of his wife and child? I don't want to say yes, and I don't want to say no. Because he showed remorse, he showed that he knew he'd done wrong whilst he was in prison. He was willing to take the scaffold without causing a fuss, if you want to use that word. He wanted to pay for his sins. And like I said, the letters that he wrote to his parents clearly shows remorse. And whether or not 8 years in prison it was long enough for the crimes he committed, that I perhaps don't agree with. Perhaps he should have done a lot longer. Perhaps he should have done a full term in prison until his dying days. But he did go on to make a life for himself. He remarried in later years to 2 women. One sadly passed away and he remarried again. But he did make a life for himself. I know a lot of people will probably say, but you know, Florence and his daughter Mary never had that opportunity, and I do get that. I do understand where people are coming from with that.
I'm with that.
And Vicky's just said she's with that. They never had the opportunity. But it is a story, for once, I'm actually lost for words, and I don't really know which side of the fence I'm on with this one. It was in 1920, just 8 years after the murder of his wife and daughter. James was released from prison and he was just 30 years old. He would eventually remarry in 1923, just 3 years after his release. and just 11 years after the murder of his wife. And he married to a lady called Emily Kay. And together they relocated over to Canada and then to Detroit, Michigan. And altogether they were together for 31 years. So this is what I'm saying. He managed to make a life for himself on one, I would presume, would have been a happy one. Now after Emily died, James remarried again to a lady called Harriet Dean. And at this time, James was now 64 years old. However, on the 27th of July 1956, and in St. Clair Hospital in Detroit, James passed away. He was 66 years old.
I have always said, if you take life, it should be life for life.
Right.
But yes, he did. It's what he said. He thought he was doing the right thing, taking him out of this cruel world. So with that in mind, I am a bit more lenient, which I shouldn't be, because his wife and child should still have had the choice. But I do think at least 25 years per child, per person.
So 50 years in life, which probably would have been a life sentence back in those days.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose, but 8 years is not enough.
8 years is a mockery. I have to say, 8 years is a mockery of the crimes themselves, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like I said, it's like 4 years for each murder, and it doesn't even take into consideration trying to take his own life, which was a crime back in the 1900s itself, which is a bit bizarre as it sounds. But yeah, it's like he's done 4 years for each crime.
And he's lived.
And he's lived. And yeah, and he's managed to be freed. And yeah.
And if it was so bad then, I want to talk about this world, but yeah, he then went and had this fabulous life in Canada and wherever. I just, no, it doesn't, it's not fair. It's not right.
No. Tell us your thoughts down below, guys, on this, and where you sit with this one. Is 8 years long enough, or should it been a lot longer? Should he hung? Tell us down below, guys. Now that is all from Burnley Cemetery and the story of James Stezaker and the events, like I said, that took place all those years ago. And as I've said in this video, I'm kind of on the fence with how I feel about it. I am siding on the air of caution, and I'm thinking, like Vicky said, perhaps James should have spent all his life in prison for his crimes. Maybe not being hung, but
not all his life, but a decent amount of it.
Well,
8 years for two lives is nothing.
Well, like Vicky's just saying, then really she should have a microphone on for things like this. But I like Vicky's saying, perhaps maybe not all his life in prison, but I'm kind of thinking, for the severity of his crimes and the fact that he did take the life of not just his wife, but also that of a 3-year-old child who didn't have any chance, basically, to survive. I perhaps think he perhaps should have done an entirety lifespan and died behind the walls of a prison. I don't necessarily think he should have been hung, even though that was the case back in the 1900s. But let me know your thoughts down below, guys. Tell us what you think of this tale. It's a sad one, it's a tragic one, but we really do appreciate that a family member has contacted us directly to cover this case. I hope we've done it justice, and I hope we've done it well. Now in the meantime, me and Vicky are going to leave Burnley Cemetery, going to go home, edit this video for you guys. Like I said, tell us your thoughts down below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, don't forget to give us a big thumbs up, and don't forget to share the video. Sharing does help the channel grow and get these stories further afield. But in the meantime, as we always say from our videos, I want you to take care, look after yourselves, and we will be back soon with other tales from our dark but at times glorious past. Stay safe, stay curious.